Claude responded, "For decades, I have watched great powers collide with one another. For decades, I have watched great powers collide with one another. And what we are witnessing today in the Middle East and in the broader rivalry between the United States and China troubles me deeply as a classical conservative, as a constitutionalist, and as someone who has devoted his entire life to the rigorous analysis of power and its consequences. The war that erupted on February 28th against Iran is not simply a regional conflict. It is a symptom of an American leadership that has lost the thread of prudence, of coherent strategy, and of respect for the limits that history imposes on those who hold power. Before we go further, I want to ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel if you have not already done so. Your subscription is what allows conversations of this depth and seriousness to reach more people around the world. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. I genuinely want to know what city or country has brought you to this discussion. And if you find this analysis worthwhile, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Now, let us get to the substance of the matter. The first thing that must be said plainly is this. The war launched by the American administration on February 28th against Iran is, by any serious standard of international law and strategic wisdom, a war of aggression. Iran, for its part, is waging a war of resistance, fighting to defend its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. The rhetoric we have heard about destroying Iran and blowing it back to the Stone Age is not merely verbal excess. It is a declaration that should chill the blood of anyone who understands what it means to threaten a civilization 6,000 years in the making. I have studied American power for decades. I have defended the leadership of the United States in the world when that leadership was anchored in recognizable principles, in law, in moral coherence. But what I observe now strikes me as profoundly alien to that tradition. The current administration does not appear to know with any clarity what it wishes to achieve in Iran. It has no defined objective. It has no recognizable pathway toward any strategic goal. And that absence of purpose is not a minor weakness. It is a catastrophe in the making. The president appeared genuinely surprised when Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. That surprise is itself revealing. If one decides to launch a war against a sovereign nation, one cannot be surprised when that nation employs every available instrument of self-defense. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz was a predictable, foreseeable, almost inevitable consequence. The fact that it was not anticipated tells us everything we need to know about the depth of strategic thinking that guides this war. The greatest certainty we have today in the international arena is uncertainty itself. The greatest constant in American foreign policy at this moment is its own unpredictability, and that is not a negotiating strength. It is a genuine danger because allies cannot plan, adversaries cannot calculate, and the entire world is held hostage to decisions that appear to be made without the weight of deliberation that history demands. It is wholly irresponsible to take the entire world hostage in this fashion through an armed offensive against a sovereign state and a full member of the United Nations, the American naval. Blockade in the Strait of Hormuz is something genuinely unusual in modern history. We are not looking at a calibrated instrument of pressure. We are looking at an action that drives up the price of oil, provokes energy crises, inflicts pain on the American citizenry itself, and generates economic consequences whose full dimensions will take months to become visible. If this war does not end soon, the result will be a financial crisis of historic proportions. I have written about economic crises for decades, and I recognize their precursors. We are watching them unfold right now with unsettling clarity. It is the responsibility of any government that is honest with its citizens to recognize when it has taken the wrong road. This war bears every symptom of that historic error, and the time available to correct it is running out. Let us turn now to China, because it is impossible to understand the full dimension of this geopolitical moment without examining the role of Beijing. From the very first day of the conflict, China condemned the war and called for de-escalation. That position has been consistent across weeks of fighting. It has not wavered. China has a clear and declared policy. It does not supply weapons to any country engaged in active warfare. That is a line that has not moved, regardless of the pressures or accusations arriving from Washington. There has been considerable speculation about Chinese assistance to Iran. I have read those speculations with the skepticism that any claim unsupported by solid evidence deserves. The commercial satellite services that China provides to Iran were contracted long before this war began. To argue that those pre-existing commercial agreements must be canceled because Washington decided to initiate an armed conflict is to indulge a fantasy that cannot survive the most elementary legal or logical scrutiny. What any sovereign country does with commercial data it has lawfully obtained is its own prerogative. What I can say with confidence is that China has exercised, with discretion but with real weight, a diplomatic influence oriented toward peace. The President of the United States himself publicly acknowledged China's role when he announced the 2-week ceasefire, thanking Beijing for its contribution in bringing Iran to the negotiating table. That is not a minor detail. That is diplomacy functioning, even if quietly and without seeking the spotlight. Now I must speak plainly about energy security and what this war means for the economies of the world. China is one of the largest energy consumers on the planet. The war in Iran and the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz directly affect that interest. However, from my long-term analytical perspective, China is better positioned than many assume to withstand even the worst energy scenario. It holds the world's largest coal reserves. It has the capacity to significantly increase its domestic production of crude oil. And it has invested massively in solar, wind, and hydroelectric power. None of those alternatives is painless or perfect, but their existence as contingency options changes the strategic calculus in a fundamental way. The Strait of Hormuz is the focal point of this war at this moment. Roughly 20% of the world's oil transits through that narrow passage. Before February 28th, that waterway was open for free navigation. No one wished to close it. It was the war itself, launched by the United States and Israel, that created the conditions leading to its partial closure. Iran has full authorization under the natural right of self-defense to employ every available means to resist an aggression that threatens to destroy its civilization. If we want the strait to reopen, the answer is not to deepen the blockade. The answer is to stop the war. That is the simplest, most direct logic available, and any calm observer can see it. What troubles me most, however, is not the conflict itself. What troubles me most is where it leads if it is not stopped in time. We are at this moment closer to the threshold of a third world war than we have been in decades. I do not say that to generate rhetorical alarm. I say it because the logic of escalation is merciless. If American ground troops were to enter Iran, as was threatened at one point, and if forces connected to Russia were to respond by fighting on Iranian soil, we would be looking at the direct confrontation between nuclear powers that we have not seen since the end of the Second World War in 1945. And there is another scenario I must address, because to ignore it would be intellectually dishonest. If Iran is pushed to the absolute limit of its capacity for resistance, it may obtain precisely what its adversaries claim to want to prevent, a nuclear weapon. Israel has accused Iran of working toward that goal for 40 years. If the present bombardment continues without a diplomatic resolution, that accusation could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The use of a single nuclear device in any conflict scenario could trigger a chain of responses that would not end with one detonation. It would end with a nuclear winter from which no human being on Earth would emerge unscathed. That is not an outcome any responsible leader should be willing to risk. I have spent decades arguing that genuine conservatism demands prudence. It demands that those who hold power calculate consequences before acting, not after. The political psychology I observe in the current administration's approach to Iran is bewildering for precisely that reason. There are 3 possible paths: escalate, cut and run, or redefine the conflict as a success and find a face-saving exit. None of them is clean, but some are less catastrophic than others. If the administration escalates, the price of oil will go through the roof. Americans will feel it at every gas pump and on every energy bill. The national economy will slide into recession. The midterm elections will be held in a climate of public discontent, that historically punishes the party in power. And if Republicans lose the House of Representatives or the Senate, the president becomes a lame duck executive from January 20th, 2027 onward, unable to deliver on the commitments he has made to his supporters. If the administration does not escalate, the image of American invincibility in the Middle East is damaged in ways that will prove durable. The dilemma is real, and those who created it should have the honesty to acknowledge it plainly. There is something I must say about the nature of the contest between the United States and China, because I have read academic theories predicting the inevitability of war between the two powers, and I regard those theories as representing a fundamental analytical error. To compare the Sino-American rivalry to the conventional power conflicts of the past is a categorical mistake. When two states possess nuclear arsenals, the logic of deterrence changes completely. There is no valid historical analogy that can be applied without acknowledging that central fact. A war between China and the United States would not produce a recognizable winner. It would produce two devastated civilizations and an unrecognizable world. I believe in what might be called the inevitability of peace between China and the United States. Not because the two countries are identical in values or systems, they are not, but because any serious calculation, stripped of belligerent rhetoric, leads to the same conclusion. Neither can win a war against the other without suffering wounds that would weaken it irreversibly. For that very reason, those who agitate for war with China as if it were a reasonable strategic option are doing the deepest possible damage to the fundamental interests of the American people. What the United States needs is to return to its senses. It needs to treat China as what it is, a power with which one can and must coexist, compete in markets, disagree in multilateral forums, and cooperate when interests converge. That has always been the path of prudence. The alternative is a confrontation with no exit. Now I want to speak about something I have observed with a combination of sadness and analytical clarity: the weakening of the Pax Americana. When I look at 2026 in historical perspective, I hold the conviction that it will be remembered as the year in which the end of that global order began, the order that the United States built and sustained for decades after the Second World War. I do not say that with any satisfaction. I say it with genuine regret, because that order, with all its imperfections, represented something real. The idea that a dominant power could exercise its leadership with something resembling responsibility. What I see today is different. I see an administration that has chosen to pick fights simultaneously with historic European allies, with international institutions, with its own universities, with press organizations, with the Catholic Church, with neighbors in the Americas. When an actor makes enemies of everyone at the same time, that is not a sign of strength. It is a sign that something fundamental has broken down in its understanding of how sustainable power actually functions. Sustainable power is not merely the capacity to impose one's will. It is the capacity to generate legitimacy, to build trust, to make others want to follow, because they believe in what you represent. That capital was accumulated by the United States across generations. It is being spent at an alarming rate, and the spending is accelerating. In contrast, China has followed a different path during this period. It mediated between Iran and Saudi Arabia, two powers that had considered each other historic enemies, and brought them to an agreement that no one expected. It has maintained a consistent diplomatic position throughout the Iranian crisis. It has offered its channels to facilitate conversations between parties that would otherwise refuse to speak. That does not mean China is an actor without its own interests. It would be naive to think so. But it does mean that its approach in this concrete moment is producing results that the American approach has not produced. There is a genuine possibility, one that I find plausible and constructive, that the upcoming visit of the American president to China could open a space for Beijing to exercise a more explicit mediating role between Washington and Tehran. China understands both parties. It has channels with both, and it has a clear interest of its own in seeing this war end. Energy stability, global financial stability, and the preservation of a multipolar order that serves its long-term interests better than any scenario of generalized chaos. Any peace agreement that emerges from this conflict will not be perfect for either side. That is the nature of diplomacy. Both parties will have to concede something, but an imperfect agreement that stops the killing and opens the possibility of a different relationship between the United States and Iran would be infinitely superior to the continuation of a war without a clear horizon. I want to speak also about the civilizational dimension of what is at stake, because I believe it is underestimated far too often. Iran is a civilization 6,000 years old. China is a civilization of 5,000 years or more. These are not nations born yesterday. They carry long memories, deep identities, and a capacity for resilience that cannot be measured in weeks or in annual military budgets. When someone threatens to destroy a millennial civilization, they are not merely making a military declaration. They are revealing a radical incomprehension of human nature and of history itself. The Chinese philosophical tradition teaches that war must always be the last resort, that it must be fully justified in law and in morality, and that it must be undertaken only after every other avenue has been exhausted. That is not weakness. That is wisdom accumulated over millennia. The contrast with the tendency to shoot first and reflect afterward that I observe in current American foreign policy is painful for someone who, like me, believes deeply in the founding principles of this republic. Classical liberalism, as I understand it and have defended it throughout my career, is not compatible with imperialism. It is not compatible with the idea that military power confers the right to dictate the destiny of other nations. The Constitution was not designed to legitimize wars of aggression. It was designed to protect the liberty of American citizens and to ensure that power was exercised with accountability. Those principles are not obstacles to American greatness. They are its foundation. If there is one piece of counsel I would offer today to those who make decisions in Washington, it would be this: defend free trade, because destroying it makes no one great and only impoverishes everyone. Protect the market economy from the temptation of excessive state intervention. Respect institutions of learning, because a republic that humiliates its own universities is digging its own intellectual grave. Treat all nations of the world, large and small, with the dignity that any sovereign state deserves, and abandon once and for all the illusion that imperialism, in any of its modern forms, can produce lasting results. It cannot. History demonstrates this without exception. The world needs stability today. It needs leadership grounded in recognizable principles, not in improvisation. It needs a United States that acts with the sobriety and intellectual rigor that its own founders considered indispensable to the survival of the Republic. That is not an unattainable ideal. It is simply the application of what we already know works. The war in Iran must end. Dialogue between the great powers must be restored, and the United States must find its way back to that understanding of itself that made it, in the finest moments of its history, not only powerful, but worthy of that power. That is the task before us, and it begins with the honesty to see the situation as it truly is, without the filters of political convenience or the distortions of pride poorly understood.